Welcome. Don't adjust your dial. Lofi Poli Sci coming at you, Michael Pickering here, talking about our famous question, what's going on in the world today? And it's time for Tuesday's Top 10 list, my friends. Last week, we did the 10 countries who spend the most on education. Today, we do the 10 countries who spend the least on education. And is the U.S. on this list? Was it on last week's list? Wait and see, or go back and check it out. And our data come from the World Bank and range from 2019 to 2021, because not all countries report how much they spend on education every year. And it is government expenditures on education as a percent of GDP. So all the money a country makes in one calendar year, what percent of that did government spend on education? That's what we're looking at today. Let's go. Coming in and tied for number 10 is Myanmar and Bangladesh, with their governments having spent 2.1% of their GDP on education. Coming in with a three-way tie for number 8, Sri Lanka, Bermuda, and Mauritania, having spent 1.9% of their GDP on education. Number 5 is Lebanon, with 1.7%. Now tied for number 4, Haiti and Papua New Guinea, with 1.4%. Number 2, Monaco, at 1.2%. And number 1, the country that spent the least on education as a percent of their GDP? Is it the United States? A 10 count to see if you can guess. Go. Number 1, Somalia, having spent 0.3% of their GDP on education. Now let's do some compare and contrast between our two lists from this week and last week. And our top spending on education as a percent of their GDP was the Marshall Islands, with 13.6% of their GDP being spent on education. 13.6 versus Somalia at 0.3%. That's almost a 12% difference on spending for education between the top and the bottom of the list. And just so you know, the world average is 4.3%. But let's look at our list in total, both of them. Least spending countries are Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bermuda, Mauritania, Lebanon, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, Monaco, Somalia. The most spending countries are Lesotho, Belize, Botswana, Sierra Leone, Namibia, Federated States of Micronesia, Bolivia, Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands. There's no regional similarities within our list, or between each list. You could say that maybe these countries in both lists have smaller populations, but since that's true for both lists, it doesn't really explain the differences as far as why which group of countries goes on which list. And it makes you wonder, what aren't we seeing in the data? What's really affecting a country's level of spending on education? Is it development? Because the vast majority of these countries on both lists are developing countries. So if that's true, that doesn't explain it. There's something else going on behind the scenes here. Something else dictating who gets what, when, and how. And that also just happens to be the very definition of politics. And that's this Tuesday's Top 10 list. Check out lofipolisci.com and add us on Instagram, people, for all your local lo-fi summertime updates. And always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Talk to you tomorrow, Lo-Fi listeners. Pickering, signing off. A little after the show info for all you who stuck around. I know you need to know, so I'm going to tell you. The U.S. data, you may be wondering? Well, the World Bank doesn't have anything newer than 2020 numbers because Apparently, we didn't feel like sending the World Bank our numbers. But let's take a quick look. The U.S. in 2020 spent 6.1% of our GDP on education, ranking us as number 39. And our GDP was, in 2020, 21 trillion, 21.06, meaning the U.S. spent $1.281 trillion in 2020 on education during COVID. That's what this means. Now, how does that compare to before? Well, in 2014, we also spent 6.1% of our GDP on education. But then it dips down in 2014. And it does not come back up to 6.1% until 2020 when COVID hits. So for 6 years, we took pretty big dips in spending on education. I wonder, what happened between 2014 and 2019 that made us decrease spending in education? Write in. I'm curious your thoughts.